welcome to the National History Center Woodrow Wilson Center seminar. One of the unknowns in Washington is what else is going on at the same time. Apparently we have run into some conflicting schedules, but anyway, this seminar operates on the principle of an Oxford seminar. If there is only one other person present, the seminar nevertheless takes place. Before we begin, could we just go around the room and ask people to identify himself, herself, and the affiliation you have, and if you don't have an affiliation, say that I'm fed up with affiliation.
My name is Caroline Moe. I'm a research assistant for Dr. Brent Schaefer, who's very sorry you couldn't be here today. But we're talking about Southeast Asian independent movements right now, really looking into writing books about that. So that's what I'm here. Okay.
My name is Leslie Bethel. I was director of the Center for Brazilian Studies in Oxford. I'm now in Rio de Janeiro, which is nice. I'm from Fundação Getúlio Vargas, and I'm a senior scholar here at the Wilson Center.
Nancy Osman and Ben Osman were India watchers, and we were one-time fellows at the Wilson Center. This is the and Dr. Lewis college mate.
Yes.
Eric Arneson, I teach at George Washington.
I'm Tim McDonald. I work here at the center.
Roshan Baba, I'm president of Kazakhstan and a fellow of Kennan Institute here.
I'm Don Wolfensberger, director of the Congress Project here at the Wilson Center.
I'm Peter Bierstaker. I'm an intern at the Cold War Project here at the Wilson Center.
I'm Christina Cherezieva, and I work for the History and Public Policy program at the
Long ago, I wrote a master's thesis on Swappo and Swanu.
I'm Erin Chapman. I'm a student at Indiana University. But this semester, I'm a research assistant here at the Wilson Center.
I'm Arnita Jones with the American Historical Association.
I'm Holly Galley. I'm a graduate student at Georgetown and former student of Professor Lewis.
And Marty Sherwin, Christian Osterman is in Berlin. And so Marty is representing the Wilson Center part of this procedure this afternoon. Our speaker is Carol Anderson, and she has done a lot of research on the connection between the civil rights movement in the United States, the NAACP, and the broader implications of this in Europe and indeed throughout the world. Carol is one of the few people who has actually linked the two of the major themes of the 20th century, civil rights in the United States and the dissolution of the European empires throughout the world. Now, Carol is presently, she teaches at Emory University, but she used to teach at the University of Missouri. I'm just assuming, by the way, that everyone knows of the book and so on that she's written, The United Nations and the African American Struggle for Human Rights, which was published by the Cambridge University Press and has won at least 2 major prizes. I'm saying that I'm assuming that everyone already knows this because it's in the announcement. What you may not know is that at the University of Missouri, what really impresses me is that she got an award by the students, the Professor of the Year. And this has actually happened at Emory University as well, where it's not merely the students, it's in particular the athletes. And Carol was recognized as the most inspirational professor at Emory University. And so, Carol, this afternoon we are looking forward to not only inspiration but insight.
Oh, Lord.
4 years from now, the Olympic coach.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you, Roger.
And I'm going to be doing the glasses off and on you because I'm fighting the reality of age. So just know that. A few days ago, my brother sent me a YouTube clip, which was really interesting because my brother is not technological at all. But he sent me a YouTube clip by the Nigerian novelist and MacArthur Award winner Chimamanda Adichie, where she told the parable of the danger of the single story. And she talked about when she was growing up in Nigeria, she read lots of British and American novels because those were the only novels that she could get her hands on. And as a young child, she started to write stories. And so she wrote stories that reflected what she had already read. So her stories were just littered with snow, apples, and blonde people. Now, her mother said, "Baby, you're in Nigeria." And she said, "But snow, apples, and blonde people," because those were the things that she knew had to be in stories because that was the only place where she saw them and in this literature. And so part of what she began to deal with as she began to understand the implications of this is what she called the danger of the single story. It's the story that we hear over and over and over again, often without interrogation, so that it becomes definitive. It becomes the only story that we know. It shapes our worldview about what is possible and what is impossible. And so she gave several examples. She talked about, for instance, what she learned was that Africa is poor. She learned that immigrants are Mexicans. She learned that the poor do not work. The danger of the single story, where I too grew up with a single story. And that was a single story that dealt with what is real black leadership. And that real black leadership was often overtly militant. And it often had swagger, that kind of move swagger. And it often wore leather. Whew. Now, unfortunately, I grew up and realized it doesn't always wear leather. But as I grew up, one of the things that I realized was that those stories did not grow up. And instead, when we're discussing black leadership, authentic black leadership, it is often caught in the danger of the single story. And so I'm going to focus in on one of those stories and then tell an alternate story. Currently, the way historians understand black leadership and decolonization, which was one of the significant seminal movements in the 20th century, is to say that basically only radicals had the vision and the mettle to take on this battle to end colonialism and imperialism. And when you read this literature, moderate leaders really don't have a place in it. And when they do have a place, it's almost like you're reading back in the days of the old antebellum South, because you will consistently run across references to, quote, the Uncle Tom of the African Revolution when they're describing black liberals in this freedom struggle. Or you will bump into depictions of Nobel Peace Prize winner Ralph Bunche as, quote, a handkerchief-headed Negro. Or an international Uncle Tom, just to elevate him. Just your regular plain old run-of-the-mill Uncle Tom. He's an international Uncle Tom. And then the one that I find most egregious, quote, a white folks nigger, unquote. Now, this is Ralph Bunche. And you'll even find in this literature what I call the tragedy of the tragic mulatto, where one scholar says, quote, the white rulers of the nation prefer dealing with lighter, non-radical Negroes, unquote. Now, what this does is to begin to kind of conjure up the imagery of the sellout that happened to Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner in those slave revolts, where those African Americans who were so enamored, as they said, with massa, that they were willing to forsake not only their own freedom, but the freedom of their people. And this is designed to basically delegitimize moderate black leaders, liberal black leaders, as saying they do not believe in true freedom. What it's also designed to do is basically to enshrine a group of radicals in this very kind of hallowed ground of resistance. And And to me, what this danger of this single story has therefore done, it has funneled and constricted our vision of what the range of black leadership can look like and should look like. And it has funneled it into a pathway that I say has not always been effective. It has, in fact, cast as sellouts, toms, and handkerchief heads those who have an abiding faith in the idea of American democracy and who have worked overtime to turn that potential of freedom into a reality, both domestically and globally. Now, in this really kind of strange world, a world where I talk about where Kafka meets Alice in Wonderland, if you can imagine something as bizarre, is that you get this kind of sense where in this literature, radicals have received what I call style points, not only for style, but for what they never accomplished. So, for example, scholar Sterling Stuckey, and he's explaining how Paul Robeson, who is an icon in this literature, how Paul Robeson really did not have a plan for dealing with how do you destroy imperialism. He said it was too big and it was too complicated for Paul Robeson to even begin to kind of conceptualize how do you take something this big down operationally. He said, but he was militant, and that was more than enough. Well, I'm going to tell another story. One where militancy without a plan was certainly not enough for the liberals in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And the NAACP's plan dealt with not only taking down colonialism, but nation building. And it was a plan that required the basis of human rights in order to build strong, viable nations on the remnants of what colonialism had wrought in Asia and Africa. The NAACP's plan included, for instance, indigenous control of natural resources, the creation of a high-quality educational system, saying that Asians and Africans had to have the education to be able to run their own nations, that they had to be able to have the development of a high-quality health care system. Because what we know is that when people are sick, the nation is sick. But when people are strong and healthy, the nation is strong and healthy. They said you also had to have land reform. And you had to have labor standards to eliminate exploitation. This is the plan that the NAACP had, starting in the mid-1940s, and they carried this plan with them through this battle for decolonization. Because what they argued was that this plan was predicated on human rights. And without human rights, Asians and Africans would be unable to find any sense of justice and hope in their societies. And that political extremism would therefore take root, because without hope, people move to the margins. And that the result would be an endless cycle of violence, repression, deprivation, and war. Now, this was not just the NAACP theorizing about what it would take, but I'm going to tell the story, yes, about South Africa and Southwest Africa, which is one of the areas where I found where the NAACP had weighed in on this issue, how they began to try to think about operationalizing their vision. Now, Southwest Africa, which is current-day Namibia, was a former German colony. And when the Kaisers, Germany, controlled Southwest Africa, they launched a brutal genocidal campaign against the indigenous people. The result was that 80% of the Hereros were wiped out. 50% of the Namas and the Berg Damaras were also killed, slaughtered. So after the end of the First World War, Southwest Africa became almost the icon, the poster child for the League of Nations mandate system. Almost. Because as much as that mandate system talked about creating a sacred trust of civilization, in fact, infusing, trying to begin to put into the international system the idea of international accountability for colonies. The League then turned Southwest Africa over to South Africa. Now, I see the contradiction. Apparently, at that point, they did not. Now, after the Second World War, and this is just to say, and I've got to, because I realize I'm on a time frame, because I've got so many tales to tell on this one. But when South Africa had control over Southwest Africa, one of the things that it did was to launch an aerial bombing attack against the Namas for refusing to pay a dog tax. I mean, so this begins to give you a sense of the level of brutality of South African rule before apartheid in Southwest Africa. At the 1945 San Francisco conference at the founding of the UN, where they're creating a trusteeship system there for the UN to replace the mandate system, South Africa intimated that, it really wasn't going to put Southwest Africa under the UN trusteeship system. In fact, it planned on annexing it and just grafting it right on to South Africa. Now, the NAACP, which was an official consultant to the U.S. delegation, went, you could just almost see, it was almost like, anybody ever remember Fred Sanford and Sanford and Son, where he clutches his heart and says, Lisbeth, I'm coming. That was basically what the NAACP did and said, oh no, and you immediately begin to see its policy research wing going full bore into force, trying to figure out a strategy to stop South Africa cold. Well, in 1946, at the first meeting of the UN, Jan Christian Smuts, who was the head of South Africa, announced that, in fact, South Africa was going to annex Southwest Africa. Now, mind you, this is right after the end of the Second World War, where everybody still has really very strong memories of the Anschluss, where Nazi Germany just took over and glommed on to Austria. And so the UN is going, did he just say they're getting ready to annex international territory? And Jan Christian Smuts said, well, yes. It just seems logical. It just seems natural. This is what we should do. And had done the groundwork with the British, basically bullied and blackmailed the British into saying, okay, we'll go along with this. And used Jim Crow against the U.S. to have the U.S. go, okay, we'll go along with this. And so the South Africans are figuring, it's got two of the big dogs in its camp. It's fine. New Zealand stood up. A member of the British Commonwealth, New Zealand stood up at that UN meeting in 46 and said, oh no, this is not how we do business. And you need to get with the program of the post-45 world, and you need to put Southwest Africa under the UN trusteeship system. And Jan Christian Smuts kind of backed up and went, because that was a choir that, the South Africans did not expect to hear from. And so he came back at the next meeting and he said, I hear your concerns, but you do not need to be concerned because, one, we did a referendum. And in this referendum, we asked not only the Europeans who live in Southwest Africa whether they wanted to be annexed, we asked the Africans as well. And 100% of the Europeans. Now, I looked at that and I said, now let me see if I get this right. You've got 35,000 Europeans, and 35,000 Europeans said yes. The numbers didn't sound right from the beginning. But 100% of the Europeans wanted to be annexed. 85% of the Africans also wanted to be annexed. Now, at this point, and I can't make this gesture, but the UN's eyebrow went up, that kind of skepticism. And as that eyebrow went up, he said, and I know you're skeptical, but you needn't be. Because the thing is that what we have done in Southwest Africa is we have spent millions and millions of dollars in buying up the best arable land for the Africans. We have provided a world-class educational system. We have provided incredible opportunities in terms of employment, and we have a world-class healthcare system. This is what we have done for the Africans. Again, the UN is skeptical, but it doesn't have a counter narrative. That counter narrative would come from this group of folks that I find absolutely amazing. One is from the Reverend Michael Scott, who was a heretic Anglican minister who had been in South Africa in the 1930s and had aligned with the only force that he saw that was as opposed to racial discrimination as he was, the Communist Party. And then with the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression back, like most, he backed away. He went, oh no, this is not what I'm about. The Reverend Michael Scott had in fact also defied his bishop by moving into an African shanty town, Tobruk, which was on the outskirts of Johannesburg. And it was residentially segregated. No European was supposed to be in this town, this little shanty town. But he believed that he was going to use his white skin as a form of demonstration about the horrific conditions that were in Tobruk. He was jailed. When he was released from jail, he had a reputation among Africans as a true freedom fighter. And so Frederick Maheru, who was the chief, the paramount chief of the Hereros, who was exiled in Bechuanaland, called on Reverend Michael Scott and said, I need you to get into Southwest Africa. I need you to find out the truth. Because South Africa has been at the UN telling a pack of lies. And only you can get in there. I cannot get into the country. I cannot get into that colony. Only you can. And then I need you to not only go in and tell the truth, I need you to go tell the world. And Reverend Michael Scott said, I can do that. Well, when the NAACP got word of Reverend Michael Scott, and part of the way that they got word, because the NAACP had begun to set up these transnational linkages with the India League, with the Aboriginal and Protection Society down in Cape Town, with the African Bureau up in London, with the International League for the Rights of Man. So you're getting this kind of transnational human rights network that's feeding information to each other about freedom fighters, about causes, and they're sharing their resources as they're figuring out these strategies. And so the NAACP gets word about the Reverend Michael Scott and says, and makes a decision, we're going to help him. We're going to do all that we can to help him. Part of that help comes from when the Reverend Michael Scott gathered his information, then he was on his way to the UN. Now the man has no money, because he has been kicked out of his parish. He has no real standing as a delegate of anything or anybody, because he's representing the Hereros, who are in a weird kind of legal limbo land, because they're not in a trust territory. They're not quite in a mandate, and they're not a recognized citizen. So he has nothing, but he has a lot, which is this kind of moral power that was coursing through the international system at that time, beginning to change the tide in the normative debates about the legitimacy of colonialism and the legitimacy of white supremacy as a ruling principle for society. The NAACP, as Reverend Michael Scott is trying to get into the country, the State Department denies him a visa, because South Africa and the British have been funneling information into the State Department and the Justice Department saying the man is a communist. Remember, this is about 46, 47. The Cold War is just coming down the pike. The loyalty oaths are just coming down the pike. The man is a communist. We have documentation that he was playing footsie with the communist South African Communist Party in the 1930s. He's a troublemaker. He cannot come in. And boom, visa denied. NAACP mobilized, which it can do very well. It put its publicity machine, and about this time it has about 400,000 dues-paying members as well. And it's like, okay, we need to flood the State Department with complaints because they have just locked out of this country a God-fearing man. And how do you have a God-fearing, godless communist? And when that message started getting sent to the State Department went, oh, man, we forgot that Anglican minister part. We just saw that communist part. So when you're keeping out a minister, a man from the Anglican Church, this makes it very difficult to be logical. So part of the savvy is knowing how to play publicity, how to hit the right notes. What they also did to get him into the country, the NAACP sat on the board of directors of the India League. And the India League then sent word into India and to Maharaj Singh, who was on the Indian delegation to the UN, saying, we've got to get Reverend Michael Scott into the country. We've got to get him into the country. So the Indian delegation appoints Michael Scott as an official aide to Maharaj Singh. So now he's got this official connotation. And because of the UN headquarters agreement, the State Department can't keep him. The Justice Department can't keep him out. So the Justice Department has to grant him a visa. And now, of course, the visa they gave him was one that had lots of restrictions. You cannot preach. You cannot talk to anybody outside, basically, of this few square blocks in Midtown Manhattan that surrounded the UN. You cannot leave New York City. And it was basically to try to silence him outside of the walls of the UN. Reverend Michael Scott got into the country, went to the UN, and he had his documentation that he had gathered when he was in Southwest Africa. And he had managed to get that documentation listed as official UN documents, which now give these little pieces of paper official status. And as official status, then the UN, the General Assembly, and the Fourth Committee, which handles trusteeship issues, are now talking about this data coming out of Southwest Africa that provides a very strong counter-narrative to what the South Africans had been saying. And based on this documentation coming straight out of Southwest Africa, the UN started asking questions of the South African delegation. Could you explain, please, why 90% of your population is allocated 10% of your budget? And the South African delegation went, how did they get those numbers? Oh, man. Could you explain, please? You said you had a world-class educational system for Africans. But as we've looked at every school from primary all the way up through university, what we find is that the only schools that are open to Africans are those funded by missionaries. There are no public schools for Africans. How did they get that number? And there's Reverend Michael Scott. And they began to target, they began to look up and going, that troublemaker. That troublemaker also, the NAACP provided him, and those of you, you know how valuable this is because you're at the Wilson Center, provided him office space. Yes, provided him office space, provided him a secretary. And you begin to think about what it takes to be able to maneuver within the UN that is so paper-driven, report-driven. And this is at a time when you don't have computers. And so you need to have somebody who can mimeograph and type beautifully without all of the errors that we make now that we're on computers. And so the NAACP, that is in the middle of its massive civil rights battles, assigns a highly valued secretary to the Reverend Michael Scott in valued office space to take on this fight. When the UN started this questioning, the South Africans, as you can imagine, balked. Because it's the kind of thing that when you tell this beautiful, elegant lie, and all of a sudden it begins to just unravel before your eyes, there was no place for the South Africans to go with this. Instead, they just kind of dug in their heels and they said, you will never see another report from us again. Now, the mandate system requires a report, an annual report on the conditions. The trusteeship system requires annual reports on the progress that is being made in that colony. To say, so you will never see another report from us. What that battle did as well in the UN is it discredited Jan Christian Smuts. And so what you see in 1948 is the election of the Nationalist Party and Daniel Malan, who instituted apartheid in South Africa. And one of the first acts of the apartheid South African government was to legislatively annex Southwest Africa in all but name only. The NAACP and Reverend Michael Scott looked up and said, oh, we got to stop this thing. We don't quite know how. We don't quite know, but we got to stop this thing. And one of the ways to stop it is through the UN. And so they worked on getting him into the country again, to get before the UN, because the Fourth Committee was beginning to get really upset about South African intransigence. What do you mean we're not going to see another report again? What do you mean you've annexed this thing in all but name only, in violation of international law? What do you mean? And so to get Reverend Michael Scott before them, they said, we need to get another stream of information. And so this time the Fourth Committee was ready to do the unthinkable. And that was to invite Reverend Michael Scott not just to present papers, but in fact to testify. And so the British and the Americans said, okay, how are we going to keep this man out of the country? How are we going to do this? So what they decided to do was to go to the Indian delegation and say, you know that little thing that you did where you put Reverend Michael Scott on your delegation? You really don't want to do that again. You don't want to set that precedent. And the Indians, who really see themselves as a force for moral change and good in the international system, were like, and why not? And they said, because we just want you to imagine some disgruntled Indian sitting on the Pakistani delegation. How would you feel about that? I mean, this is hardball. Indians said, yeah, you're right, not gonna do it. Wouldn't be prudent. And so the Indians decided they would not reassign Reverend Michael Scott to their delegation. NAACP looked up and said, we've got something for you. They also sat on the board of directors of the International League for the Rights of Man. The International League for the Rights of Man had official consultative Class B status with the UN. And so as long as the International League for the Rights of Man then made the Reverend Michael Scott an official delegate to the there was no way that the U.S. could stop him from getting into the country again. I love this brilliance because it's understanding the rules that seem arcane, but it's a way to fight, as one of my students said, with your mouth inside the head of a lion. And this is in fact what you see happening here. This kind of inside fighting. So they got Reverend Michael Scott into the country again as a member of the International League for the Rights of Man. Again, massive restrictions on his visa about where he could go. Walter White, who's the head of the NAACP, looked up and said, this is ridiculous. If we can't fight the visa restrictions and get this man's word out, then what we're going to do is to bring the mountain to Muhammad. And since Walter White had an apartment in Midtown Manhattan, you're seeing where this is going, don't you? Since he had an apartment in Midtown Manhattan, Walter White invited senators, congressmen, labor leaders, the press, ministers to his apartment for cocktails and teas, with the special guest of being the Reverend Michael Scott. And by having these opinion makers sitting in the same room with the Reverend Michael Scott, talking about the issue of South Africa, talking about the issue of apartheid, talking about the issue of colonialism. This is again how you begin to see the international norms reshaped. They also worked on getting him to see Eleanor Roosevelt because they understood that this was a human rights issue. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the head of the UN Commission on Human Rights and also a key member of the U.S. delegation, had been sitting in on these State Department briefings where the information is coming in from MI5 and from the South Africans that Reverend Michael Scott is a communist. And so when Reverend Michael Scott first called to Eleanor Roosevelt's office to set up an appointment, she said, oh, I know that commie. He's the one who's been bothering and besieging everybody at the UN. But her secretary said, but you know, he called from the NAACP's office. So why don't we check through them to see what this man is really about? And so this is part of where you see the NAACP using its credibility, its legitimacy, as a way to open doors that would heretofore have been closed. And they explained to Eleanor Roosevelt's staff, oh no, he's not a commie. He's being labeled as such because he believes in true racial equality, because he believes in democracy, because he believes in freedom. And this is why the South Africans have branded him that way. And so Eleanor Roosevelt met with him. She said, oh, he's a little too intense. I don't think he's going to do too well before the UN. He's just a little intense. But he testified, and the British tried to stop it, but they couldn't. He testified before the United Nations Fourth Committee about the conditions in South Africa and Southwest Africa. He talked about the criminalization of blackness and the creation of a migratory labor system based on these criminal laws and pass laws and vagrancy laws. He talked about the need, the near slavery conditions on the white-owned farms. By the time he was through, the UN said, okay, we've seen enough. And they requested an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice asking exactly what is the status of Southwest Africa. The ICJ came back in 1950 with an advisory opinion that said you cannot force South Africa to put Southwest Africa under the UN trusteeship system. But South Africa cannot annex it. It's international territory. And because South Africa gained control of it via the mandate system, it still has to make annual reports as the sacred trust of civilization to the only international body recognized to receive those reports, and that would be the United Nations. Milan's government looked at that and said, or harumph, and said, we like the first part of that advisory opinion. We're going to ignore the second part of that advisory opinion. So no, we're not putting it under the trusteeship system, and we're still not sending in reports. That set up what I call an incredible showdown, because you have South Africa really digging in after the ICJ opinion. Part of what they did is they said, you know what, we will listen to, if we do send reports, we'll send the report to the British, the Americans, and the French. Now, that would leave out most of the globe. and the Americans went, oh, you can't do that. I mean, you can't do that. And you can't do that because you're violating the basic tenets here. And it's not like they're asking for too much. But a State Department report also said, what we realize is that there is no way that apartheid South Africa can treat Southwest Africa as a sacred trust of civilization because their racial politics, in fact, are absolutely contradictory to treating any people of color as a sacred trust of civilization. And that's the conundrum, and that's why they're not sending in reports. Now, why I call it the showdown is because those of you who know about Mary Dudziak's book and Tim Borselman's book that deal with the difficulty that the U.S. had, as I call it, being the Jim Crow leader of the free world. You know, again, one of these things is not like the other, is that every time there was a lynching, every time there was what we call one of these legal lynchings where there was a trial that was absolutely horrific and you knew exactly that the trial was fake, but the person, usually a black man, was sentenced to death in the electric chair. That news rang out across the world, and it made what Wendell Willkie would call a hollow mockery of American claims of democracy. And so part of the way that the State Department tried to counter this was to have what they call a few black faces, some black faces in these key delegations to say, this is the land of democracy. Look, we have African Americans in key areas on our U.S. delegation in our international fora. So, what do you mean? We've got the unfinished business of democracy, but it shows that we're working on it. So one of the people that they tapped was Channing Tobias. Channing Tobias was chairman of the board of the NAACP. Channing Tobias was tapped to lead up the American delegation for the Fourth Committee dealing with colonial and trusteeship issues. And Channing Tobias told his State Department handlers, I'm a team player, and you can count on me to play the team game. But there are times when my conscience will speak to me. And they went, yeah, okay, whatever. Well, when the issue of Southwest Africa came to the fore, Channing Tobias, the British and the Americans had it all arranged, because what the Fourth Committee had decided to do was not to hear from Reverend Michael Scott, but was to hear from the leaders of the Hereros, Namas, and Bergdamaras themselves, and begin to think about how absolutely radical and subversive it was in 1951 to hear from those who were colonized, to in fact allow them to have voice in an international forum, to speak about the conditions under which they lived, labored, and died. The British and the South Africans went ballistic. It was just like, this is unprecedented, this is unheard of, this is unconscionable. There is no means for this. What are you thinking? And the British and the Americans had worked out a kind of almost like playing doubles in tennis, where first the British would hit and then the Americans would come in with the kill shot. They had worked it all out. So the British get up, they're doing their talk, and then they turn to the American delegation to kind of like ride in and just end it. Instead, when the American delegation, Benjamin Garrett, got up to stand up, Channing Tobias, as chair of the delegation, turned to him and said, sit down. And Garrett was like, sit down. Garrett sat down. Francis B. Sayers gets ready to stand up. Sit down. And the British are looking, going, what just happened to our cavalry? We are out here all by ourselves. All by ourselves, where the vote was 37 to 7 to allow the Namas, Bergdamaras, and Hereros to testify directly before the UN about the conditions in Southwest Africa. Ralph Bunche sends the invitation out to the Hereros, the Namas, and Bergdamaras. The NAACP sends the money to pay for their trip to get them up to the UN meeting. The British started complaining to the Americans, to the State Department. Channing Tobias is a cipher. This is lamentable performance. We had a deal. We're going to have Sir Anthony Eden call Secretary of State Dean Acheson and let him know what just happened at this meeting. And the State Department is sitting there going, uh-oh, this may not be good. Meanwhile, the South Africans have decided that they are not going to allow the leadership of the Hereros, Namas, and Bergdamaras to leave Southwest Africa. And when that message finally comes through several days later, you could see the seven that had voted against, the seven colonial powers, sitting up there going, yes. And Channing Tobias saw it too. As he told Walter White, I witnessed the brush off. And so what he did was he signaled that the power of the U.S. government would be more than happy to hear from the Reverend Michael Scott about the events that have just unfolded. Again, the British are like, and the Reverend Michael Scott begins to tell this horrific tale about the silencing of the voices that need to be heard at the UN, about the power and destructiveness of a regime that is trying to undermine the tenet of international accountability. What happens at the end of this meeting is that the South Africans walk out of the Fourth Committee, and they basically leave for a while. You also have the UN beginning to set up committees to look not only at the conditions in Southwest Africa, but also the conditions in South Africa itself, where you're beginning to see the penetration of national sovereignty to look at massive human rights violations that are occurring within a nation. Now, I happen to think that this is an amazing tale, a powerful tale. But what did the contemporaries at that time say about it? Well, oh, I missed it. W.E.B. Du Bois, here we go, who had been fired from the NAACP. He said, the NAACP is useless in the fight to free Africa from colonialism, because the association was, quote, just a bourgeois setup, afraid to do anything that is not respectable, unquote. And communist William Patterson, who had tried to submit a petition at the same meeting charging the U.S. with committing genocide against African Americans but was blocked by the NAACP, fumed that, quote, the very same Americans who interceded in order that the Reverend Michael Scott might speak were the same ones who flatly refused to intercede when the petition dealing with genocide in the United States was submitted, unquote. Similarly, historians decades later tell us that the NAACP was so infused with liberal ideology that all it could think of was try to get more African Americans in the foreign policy bureaucracy, as if that was going to make any difference. And what we see, they tell us, is that the timidity and collusion with the U.S. government led to a Faustian bargain, whereby the NAACP received a pittance of civil rights concessions at home in exchange for silence on foreign policy issues and acquiescence in American and West European control of the world's colored peoples, unquote. Yet what the association did was not silence. It was not abandonment. It was simply another way of fighting. And this is a story, a rich, complicated story, that we won't know until we begin to write liberals back into this story of decolonization. And let me just end with this, because this question about what is real black leadership and how does it move and how does it think, and I've got tons of these stories, but I'm going to just leave it at this one here, is that there was a recent blog on blackagenda.org describing the anger about Tavis Smiley canceling the State of the Black Union, which is an annual event that he would hold where he'd have major black folks coming in talking about the condition of black America. This blog. At this juncture in history, for Tavis Smiley to punt on the state of the Black Union, and equally for his past participants not to call him out on it, says a lot about the state of the Black Union. I mean, do we need Tavis or Obama or some other prominent sellout to put out a call to order, or can some other prominent Negro take the lead? Well, this coming Monday, we'll have to listen and bear with loads of crap and platitudes and distortions of MLK's legacy about post-racial this, about the advances of African Americans, about blah, blah, blah. But not one of the frauds and incompetence perpetrating as black leaders will talk about the need for a new war on poverty, one led by the black working middle and professional class instead of the liberals in D.C., unquote. Thank you.
Carol, a preliminary question.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Ralph Bunche, and I know that there are several people here who are interested in Ralph Bunche. Could you give us your assessment of him, how he plays in and out of the...
My assessment of Ralph Bunche continues to grow the more research that I do. Ralph Bunche had a savviness that was incomparable. Let me just tell another story, quick one. This dealt with the Italian colonies issue, Somalia, Eritrea, and Libya. And they had been at loggerheads. The British and the Italians had been at loggerheads for years about Italy trying to regain control of these colonies. Now, these colonies didn't want to see Italy. They didn't want to see anybody. They wanted their own independence. But after these loggerheads, the British and the Italians had come up with what they called the Bevan-Sforza deal, where they were going to carve up these Italian colonies among allies, so that Libya was not really going to be Libya. There was going to be a piece that the French were going to get, a piece that the Italians were going to get, and a piece that the British were going to get. And then for Eritrea, there was a piece that the Anglo-Sudan was going to get, and a piece that Ethiopia would get. And then for Somalia, Italy would get Somalia. And so in this carve-up, you see the Somalis are like, yo, when do we get us? The Libyans are like, whoa. And the Somalis, the NAACP had been working with Abdullahi Isa, who was the head of the Somali Youth League. And so they were on top of this. They knew something was just going wrong. And as this Bevan-Sforza deal was really kind of kept on the down low until it hit the UN, where the UN had to sanction it, Ralph Bunche got on the phone to Walter White of the NAACP and said, man, by the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes. You need to get down here fast and try to blow this thing apart. And that was the role that Ralph Bunche played. He was a conduit of incredible insider information into the NAACP so that the NAACP would know exactly what was going on, where to hit, and what to do. The NAACP took that information, sent basically what I call almost a SWAT team down to the UN, and began doing what they did in Congress. They started counting heads in the General Assembly because the Bevan-Sforza deal was going to require so many votes in the General Assembly. So they counted and they said, these folks are going to vote for it. These folks are going to vote against it. Those folks in the middle are straddling. And that's where we're going to, in fact, direct all of our lobbying efforts. And those lobbying efforts paid off big. Because when the vote came down, and the Americans were sitting there very confident, as were the British, because the Americans had put aid out, economic development aid, saying we get the vote we want, you get the aid. It's real simple. Haiti broke from the pack and said nay. The Americans went, what just happened here? And with that, it was cascading. It was like dominoes, and the entire Bevan-Sforza plan fell apart. The response was that the U.S. government looked up and said, we cannot continue, and I love the quote that Roger has, to back a deal that smacks of old-fashioned Western imperialism. Instead, what we've got to do is to present a united Libya before the UN, and one where we're really paying attention to the needs of the indigenous people, the wants of the indigenous people. And so what you saw, instead of Libya being carved up into three separate distinct units that had somewhere between a 25 to 100-year time limit for a trusteeship, instead you see a united Libya coming up in 1952 under a British trusteeship that's going to last only 1 year. I mean, so this is like the impact of a Ralph Bunche. I'm seeing him making these calls consistently when things are going down in the UN. But again, you would not know that if you're just reading the standard literature of African Americans and anti-colonialism, because he is consistently described as a handkerchief head and an international Uncle Tom.
Questions, comments? Carol, as I was listening to you, I was thinking that among all the other wonderful information that you were presenting, you were offering a great dissertation topic, the Reverend Michael Scott, to somebody. Is there a book on him?
It just came out. And it just came out, called The Troublemaker. And I know that it just came out because when I first started this and his name kept popping up in the NAACP records, I thought, I've got to get to this man's records, right? And I'm doing all the kind of Google searching and WorldCast searching. I can't find him. I happen to be over in London at the University of London. I get on their intranet, and boom, his records pop up at Oxford. And I hopped on a train, got to Oxford just at the last minute, got 2 minutes left 2 days left in Britain. And she was like, "And you didn't call? Do you have your reader's card?" His records are closed, and my heart is, because his biographers have sole access until the biography is published. And but she was wonderful. She said his records are open, his organization's records are open. And I got into the Africa Bureau papers. And then she called me a couple of years later when I was back in the States and said, "The biography is done." I was immediately on a plane. And the records are rich because he is a very complicated man. And I don't think his biography gives you the depth of this man's complexity.
When did he die?
77 or so. Yeah. And he died feeling like his life had been in vain. Because as we know, Namibia was not free by 1977. So he had been in this struggle for years, feeling like he had been toiling and had nothing to show for it. But it was really just around the corner in terms of historical time.
I'd like to mention briefly that when I started Indian studies and having read Kipling and all these people, it's not that important. I was reading the white man's, the British colonialist view in the novels as well as in the state papers and all that kind of stuff. That gave me a completely, if you will, a Clorox slant on the British role in India, all of which was not untrue. But at the same time, when I started reading Indians' history of India and a lot of other state papers, I found out how much I'd been misled by the rather entertaining literature that I'd started out with for a number of years.
The danger of the single story.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the point. It's exactly the point. And there are many other things. There are many other things in your marvelous talk that remind me of what was going on in New Delhi under the British, after, and so forth and so on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Don.
How do I do for time?
I was wondering, are there any comparable stories for French West Africa or British East Africa in the interwar period, the pre-independence period for any of these countries, or did you just concentrate on the ones you were talking about today?
No, what I did, I told myself I'm going to go wherever the NAACP goes. So I'm in literature and things that I just I never knew about Southwest Africa, really, until I started getting into this. So one of the places that I'm seeing is the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya. And so far what I've seen there is that here you had the NAACP, which is a nonviolent organization, trying to figure out how do you reconcile the violence of the Mau Mau with the belief in colonial liberation and the understanding that justice was not done by the decision not to grant the Kikuyu back their land that was seized from them. And so the way that they described it was part of this, which was that when people are denied basic justice, extremism takes root. And this is what awaits the rest of the colonial world, unless you heed Mau Mau. What they also did was to pull Constance Baker Motley, who was part of Thurgood Marshall's key legal team on the Brown decision, was to pull Constance Baker Motley off of that team. Because the NAACP was getting lots of letters in from Kenyans that the U.S., the Immigration and Naturalization Service, was trying to deport back to Kenya during the Mau Mau emergency. And these folks were afraid that they were going to be slaughtered because although Mau Mau had been depicted overwhelmingly in the media as a race war, the overwhelming victims of the Mau Mau were Africans. And so you had Constance Baker Motley and the NAACP, in fact, then waging in with the INS to keep the Kenyans from being deported during the Mau Mau Rebellion. So I am looking at pieces of that. I haven't found so much on the West Coast, like with Nigeria. There, of course, is Ghana, where there's this kind of mass celebration. And I'm seeing that in 1944, the NAACP held what they called a colonial conference. And in there, they brought in folks like Kwame Nkrumah and Nnamdi Azikiwe from Nigeria, as well as, so these were basically the college students, the African leadership, African and Asian leadership, because they had someone whose name is escaping me right now, from Burma, in there to begin to talk about what a plan for a post-world world looked like. So because the NAACP was already strategizing to become part of the U.S. delegation to the UN in some kind of official capacity. And so to be able to begin to talk about and to shape the State Department's plan for colonialism and anti-colonialism. I'm seeing some engagement. I haven't gotten deeply into these records yet with Tunisia and Morocco. And I'm thinking that's going to be really interesting when I get in there. And I'm also seeing engagement with Indonesia and the Indonesian liberation struggle when the Dutch tried to retake Indonesia after the defeat of the Japanese. So that's where I am right now.
Sure.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Thank you so much. What a fascinating talk. I am really inspired by this history of the NAACP that many members of the American community and the world community probably are not aware of. And I would like to know if you could just update us in terms of, from that period of time that you've tracked during your talk, in terms of what happened to that power of the NAACP voice worldwide, because with sort of the civil rights movement and the cap of that in 1968 with the death of Dr. King, what happened to that voice worldwide, into the 1970s until today? And the same with the United Nations. The depiction you give of the birth of the United Nations is quite incredible, considering this is in the middle of Jim Crow and all of the racism of the US of A, and yet here was the United Nations in New York speaking, to some extent, against colonialism and imperialism, and to some extent, I guess, against racism.
Oh, yes.
So what happened to the power of the United Nations and being that voice around the world? And perhaps you can speak to what decapitated these organizations, right?
Whoa.
Because they both had that power of presence. To your talk in the 1940s and 50s, but we're in 2010, and neither of those voices seem to be as strong. Thank you very much. By the way, my name is Allison Johnson, and I'm an international political economist. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Thank you. That is now that's the dissertation.
I'm looking for a dissertation.
Yeah, because I too have been thinking about that. I was let me start today and then kind of try to back up. I was at a conference at UVA a couple of weeks ago, and Julian Bond, of course, was there, and we began talking. Julian Bond's the head of the chairman of the NAACP, and we're talking. And he said, well, we're getting ready to try to set up an international component of the NAACP. We think it's time. And I said, yes. And I think so it's like it's been hanging there. And you saw them in the anti-apartheid movement, although when you read the anti-apartheid stuff, you won't see them there. But they were. And this is, again, the danger of the single story. But I think part of what happened, how do I describe it, is that when Roy Wilkins came to the leadership in '55, and it was solely his, I still saw some movement on the international front. But Roy never quite got internationalism. He got pieces of it. I mean, so he was clearly there in the battle for the Italian colonies. And I think that was because he got baptized into it in the 1930s when Italy invaded Ethiopia. And so the Italian colonies are linked with Ethiopia, and Ethiopia holds that kind of very kind of sacred ground. And so he got that. He was also heavily involved in the issue of South Africa and Southwest Africa. But apartheid was so raw in your face. There was absolutely nothing subtle about it that, Roy got it. But the other pieces he wasn't quite sure of. And then as he's dealing with the rush of the civil rights movement, watching as he saw it, and I'm sure many of you know this history, as he saw it, the NAACP had been fighting since 1909 on all of this, and he looks up and he sees SCLC that was founded in the mid-1950s, and King getting this kind of spokesman for the Negro and spokesman of the civil rights era, and Roy is looking, and this is where he's devoting a lot of his energy. This is not to say, because one of the things that I'm tracking, and I haven't gotten deeply into this, is a thing called the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa. That Roy Wilkins, Whitney Young from the Urban League, Martin Luther King from SCLC, A. Philip Randolph, and I'm leaving somebody out. He was with SCLC, yeah. That they decided that they needed to begin to create that would serve as almost like an African lobby in the United States, lobbying for development aid for some of the African nations that were still under colonialism, lobbying for independence, and then development aid. And the NAACP throughout provided somewhere between 1/3 to 1/2 of that organization's budget. And this is through most of the civil rights era. So when it's being called on to finance getting folks out of jail from the Freedom Rides, and being called to finance getting folks out of jail in Birmingham, and it's still financing the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa. And so trying to figure out, I haven't worked it all out in my head, but it's like watching that transition from fighting for political independence. This is part of what we were talking about this weekend, fighting for political independence, to realizing, and they realized it early on, to now fighting for economic independence as these nations, these colonies become nations, but still are very dependent usually on a cash crop economy. It's like, how do you in fact begin to fight that, particularly when, because this was the other component, particularly when they were using a human rights framework. But what happened in the Cold War is that human rights got sheared off. And so human rights are indivisible. But the U.S., because of its power, shared political civil rights over here and said those were real rights, and put economic and social and cultural rights over here and said those are mere aspirations. Those aren't even real rights. In fact, they emanate out of that kind of Marxist thought where people have the right to health care and the right to education. So those aren't really rights. Those are aspirations that aren't grounded in anything but communism. And so when you're looking at trying to nation build and realizing, as I said early on, that you had to have a quality education system, you had to have a quality healthcare system, you had to have land reform, those are the things that are designated as communistic. And so I'm trying that, if I took this study, I'm stopping this study in 1960 because I'm already at almost 150 manuscript collections on this, so I just can't go much further. But I know that there's another part of this story, and that's the piece that you're getting at. I think with the UN, that in the UN was absolutely essential. Mason Sears, who was the U.S. representative on the trusteeship committee, talked about how the UN provided the forum that changed the terms of debate about colonialism. Because one of the things about the General Assembly, unlike the Security Council, is that the voices of small nations carried weight they could be heard. And when you started getting a number of these smaller nations working in blocks together, coordinating their message, in fact, it really began to become transformative. And as more and more nations from Africa and Asia became nations and joined the UN, they created a much larger and larger bloc. Part of what I think happened is that, and I saw this a lot in the American papers, the State Department papers, as well as the Foreign Office papers, was this agonizing about what do we do with the UN. We used to almost have the UN in our pocket. You know, we had the folks that we knew we could count on. Our voices carried weight. We basically controlled this thing. And now this thing is out of control. And I think that becomes part of the discussion about the perception about the lack of power of the UN. And it didn't help that the U.S. withheld lots of its funding that it was supposed to provide to the UN. But the UN has always been problematic in the United States. There was always a large core that saw it as an enemy of U.S. national sovereignty, of U.S. power. And so this transformation of the UN into, when you get all of these Asian and African and Latin American nations in it, just added to the kind of distancing from it.
Yes, Eric.
Thanks. I'm wondering if you could talk more about the proponents of this single story, those folks that you're arguing against. Yours is something of a lonely voice in this literature, but is a welcome voice.
Thank you,
but I'm
Eric.
trying to understand the folks who dismiss the NAACP, who wave their hand at liberals and say, too little, too late. I don't quite understand what makes them tick and what precisely they're arguing. So if you could just lay out for us, why don't they like the NAACP's approach to international affairs, and why is it 20 years after the end of the Cold War, they still cling to this notion that there is this thing, the left, that somehow got it right and everybody else got it wrong?
That's an easy slow ball question.
I didn't mean for it to be that.
I know, I'm kidding. And I think multiple forces are at work here. I think part of the force deals with historians, the craft of history itself. We love a great story. And when you look at the folks on the left, when you look at a Paul Robeson, when you look at a W.E.B. Du Bois, who has to leave the country towards the end of his life, it's this great martyred arc where you get somebody who's got it all and gives it up for the cause. I mean, as historians, we love to write those kinds of really powerful, elegant, heart-wrenching stories about the kind of lone hero against all odds. Then you take an organization like the NAACP, big, bureaucratic. We don't like to, the turn in history is we don't like to write about bureaucracies, really. And we really don't want to deal with power. We're into, seeing how the folks on the ground got it, and we refuse to even conceptualize that the NAACP has anything to do with the folks on the ground. Except if you go into their records, what you see are massive letters from workers and sharecroppers and domestics, saying, help us. So part of it has to deal with just the craft of history. I think the other piece is that when the first article came out really trying to analyze African Americans and anti-colonialism, the records of the NAACP were not open. And because those records weren't open, and those records are voluminous, I think they may be the largest collection at the Library of Congress. Those records are voluminous, and they're beautifully organized. But so what the scholar did was to look at the Crisis, which is the magazine of the NAACP. So that scholar could get a sense of what the NAACP was saying, but not what it was doing. And then when subsequent scholarship came, and that article was written in 1971, when subsequent scholarship was happening, scholars were more interested in the left. And so they looked at that article to say, oh, the NAACP turned its back on colonial peoples when the Cold War came because it cut a deal with the Truman administration to get some civil rights concessions at home in exchange for acquiescence to imperial control of folks in Africa and Asia. And so people would just cite that article. And then the next article would come, and it would cite that article that had cited the previous article as well as the previous article. And then the next article would come, and it would cite that article, and the first article. And so you began to get this very lengthy footnote that looked like scholarship, except it wasn't in the NAACP papers to say what the NAACP actually did. The next component, I mean, there are all these little components. The next component was that because you do need to be able to quote a primary source, the first person who said this. And so what was easy were the W.E.B. Du Bois papers. But nobody took into account that he had been fired by the NAACP. So I know this sounds so basic, but he was fired. And so when somebody would say, well, what do you think of the NAACP? They're nothing but a bunch of bourgeois, and that would become the quote as proof that here is a contemporary who says that they turned their backs. And so that became the frame. And I think part of it also deals with one of the major works says that part of how she envisioned her scholarship was to pull Paul Robeson out of obscurity, the obscurity that Harold Cruz's The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, that had defined Paul Robeson basically as a communist dupe, to in fact reverse that. So you got basically history with an agenda. And that is, I think, part of it. And the other piece, I also think, is that because the Brown decision did not turn out the way everybody thought it would. And so that was one of the NAACP's major things. The thing you broke Jim Crow. But as Gary Orfield talks about, schools are more segregated than ever. We know that our school system doesn't work. We know that we still have systemic racism in the United States. And so it looks like the liberal strategy didn't work at all, so boom, everything gets thrown out. Yeah.
Carol, I have a related question. It's you say that you're stopping in 1960, but what puzzles me is whether the 1960s, not merely the interpretation, but what actually is going on in the 1960s is more or less a continuation of the same story, or whether it's really a different story. It certainly becomes much more intense, and yet there are links with the Vietnam, anti-Vietnam War.
Yes. And Roger, if there was a way that I could get to full professor and be able to take this story to its real logical conclusion, I probably would. But I had to stop at 1960 with the UN Declaration dealing with the independence of colonial peoples. I might take this story up to the crisis in the Congo, which will at least take us into 61. Because I think that is another kind of key critical event, watching how African Americans are beginning to kind of array around the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the secession of the Katanga province, the rise of Tshombe and then Mobutu and all of that. So I might take it into the Congo, but the story, I think, becomes even more intense because what it requires is that kind of nuance and complexity that I'm asking for in terms of African American leadership, and that is in terms of African leadership, to be able to make those assessments based on, is this nation moving in the right direction? How do we throw our support behind it so it can get where it needs to go? Particularly when you see some of the things that you don't necessarily agree with. And so I think that story in the 60s, because there you get, the overthrow of Ezekiel, you get the overthrow of Nkrumah. You get the turmoil in the Congo. I think that story, as you said, becomes even more complicated, but its roots are back here. Maybe that's the next book.
Well, maybe in some way, this is not the next book, but this book, because I'm listening to you and I'm trying to think what I know about the historiography of the civil rights movement and how different your approach is and how it changes that story. And tell me if I've got it right or not. What I'm hearing is an analysis that suggests that the American civil rights movement doesn't begin with Brown versus Board of Education in '54. It doesn't begin with Birmingham, Rosa Parks refusing to move to the back of the bus in '55. It begins in some way, of course you can go all the way back, but it begins in a very important way with the United Nations attack on anti-colonialism, which is supported by the NAACP in both surreptitious and bureaucratic and very obvious ways also, and that in many ways the framework and structure of what was going to follow in the 50s and 60s follows from this. Is that right, or is that...
And in fact, there is a literature that is emerging out of there called the Long Civil Rights Movement, from a seminal article by Jacqueline Dowd Hall in, help me, Devin, 1995, 96? And what she argues is that the movement really began in the 30s with the agitation for workers' rights, for civil rights. But the problem is that literature on the long civil rights movement is very focused again on and on the left. And so it does have an international component, but again, it's what the left did in the international component. And so you see, in fact, the domestic literature based on the civil rights movement and the international literature based on decolonization fusing in the long civil rights movement, but it fuses in terms of the left, saying that the shortcomings domestically and the shortcomings internationally are because the left was destroyed. And that becomes the kind of summary for both sides. But I'm saying, what happens if we broaden our lens and we in fact see where the base of most African Americans were, and that's in this kind of liberal wing, and watching how they mobilized, because the left really was a very small component. The black left was a very small component of African Americans. So just to give some perspective, one of the organizations that has received a lot of attention is a group called the Council on African Affairs, led by Paul Robeson. At its peak, the council had maybe about 100 members. The NAACP at its peak had 500,000. So imagine writing this history about what 100 members did, and saying that this group that had 500,000 just turned its back, and so you don't even have to pay any attention to them. It means you've got this really kind of skewed warping of the kind of historical narratives. And so we've got, again, the danger of the single story in that. So even with the long civil rights movement, because it's predicated on the activism of the left, we miss the activism of the liberals and the things that they were able to accomplish and do. And I think only when we begin to weave them into this narrative can we really begin to make an assessment about what we have attained, what we haven't attained, and why.
Carol, that's very interesting. We need to begin to draw this to a close, but would you mind if we collect some last questions and then you can ask them? We want to be sure to let everyone know.
Because these were good questions. Thank you.
Yes.
This may be too big a question, but I'm just wondering, with the liberal NAACP, if you could elaborate on how they negotiated the issue of socialism and communism. I'm wondering, you mentioned that you touched on this, but both of the domestic, it really does become very much a right versus left kind of stereotype, and I'm wondering how they come down in the middle on that issue, how they handle it. You did talk about that.
Leslie.
Over here. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Just from ignorance, going back to the beginning of your story and the creation of the UN in '45, I fully understand the position of the Brits on the Southwest African, South Africa issue, but I'm still a bit puzzled about the US position.
Yes.
Is it not, why was the US so obdurate, so hostile to anti-colonialism apparently, so prepared to give in to South Africa, to Smuts? Is it not the case that there's a periodization here? From mid-47, from the beginning of the Cold War, it begins to be clearer why the US government takes the positions it does. But isn't there that interval between the end of the Second World War, the creation of the UN, when there are liberals in the US government, and there is a debate going on, and there's a support? For example, I know about Latin America, not Africa, and for that short period, maybe less than 2 years, the US government is supporting democratization, is supporting labor unions, is supporting the creation of something that begins to look like social democracy in Latin America. Then it changes. Now, is there not something going on in this period in the US government?
Great question.
Okay.
I think that's it.
Yes, that's it.
So-
Okay.
Well, those two questions are
Actually,
could occupy,
I just want to see if you could speak a little bit more about the friction between Du Bois and Walter White, and unpack that a little bit for people, and why Du Bois was sacked.
Okay, will do. Okay. The NAACP, socialism and communism. The NAACP hated the communist. And I can get almost Elizabeth Barrett Browning on it, from the depths and the breadths and the heights that their soul shall reach. They hated communism. They hated communism, one, because they didn't believe that the communists were legitimately fighting for the rights of African Americans. They were leery of them during Scottsboro, the Scottsboro trial. They believed that they had had their suspicions verified with the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, the way that the communists basically broke from the Popular Front. And they really believed that they had had it verified in that interim period, 39 to 41, where the communists were talking about the World War II was an imperialist war. It didn't matter who won, the British or the Nazis. They're both fascist and all of that. To then when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, and all of a sudden the communists are so on board with this war that they're trying to clamp down A. Philip Randolph's March on Washington movement, because African Americans were still dealing with Depression-era unemployment. By this time, and the defense industries are refusing to hire black people while they're saying, God, we need some labor. We just can't find any warm bodies. We want to build these planes. Oh, Detroit, I know you're sitting up there with a 25% unemployment rate. We can't find any bodies. And so the communists are trying to slamp down on the March on Washington movement. And the NAACP looks up and says, see, I told you, they are not about black people. They are about whatever the Soviet Union wants. Now, when it came to socialism, they worked hand in hand with A. Philip Randolph, who was an avowed socialist. They didn't have a problem with A. Philip Randolph. Now, in fact, Walter White, who headed the NAACP, was really good about trying to take A. Philip Randolph's ideas and slap the NAACP's name on it. So, as Eric knows, who wrote a fabulous biography on A. Philip Randolph. So, or the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So the socialism didn't bother them as much, but communism really, really did. And they were also very clear. So in terms of like the Reverend Michael Scott, they just said he's not a communist. And they didn't want to see anything or hear anything about any of his communist connections in the 1930s. They just said he's not a communist. When the State Department or the Justice Department tried to throw Abdullahi Issa out of, who's the head of the Somali Youth League, tried to throw him out of the country saying he had communist ties, the NAACP said that's a load of hooey. In fact, what he is, he's a nationalist. He's a freedom fighter. And you're just trying to slander him with the name of communist. So for them, communism was a slander, and it was an illegitimate label put on folks who were fighting for colonial independence. And so that's how they negotiated that. Part of the way that they negotiated domestically was they held their internal, I call it a purge. Manfred Berg would disagree. But they were very vigilant about their branches and whether their branches were holding joint events with known communist organizations. And they would slam down on that branch so hard, and they would rig elections to make sure that communists didn't win elections in the branch. I mean, and then so when the McCarthy witch hunts came after them for being a communist organization, they could say, "Oh no, we're not," and they would challenge the McCarthyites. So that was. I mean, this is a high wire act, because they're dealing with a virulent form of racism. They're dealing with virulent anti-communism, and they're dealing in an environment where anti-colonialism is seen as being pro-Soviet. So, I mean, they are on a really high wire over the Grand Canyon with no net. So I stand in awe of the fact that they were able to negotiate as much as they did. That wonderful moment in time, there was intense debate, and thank you for that, because I glossed over it. There was intense debate within the State Department about the U.S.'s alignment with South Africa, and intense in terms of saying there was a component that said, well, you know, this is a civilized nation, and if you really do that one man, one vote thing, Africans aren't ready to run their own countries. I mean, it's because racism was alive and well in the United States. And so you had that component coming through in the State Department records. You also had this sense where, what's his name? Joseph Sweeney. John Utter, I think was his name. I'm forgetting the name. But we called the racism utter nonsense. You know, that this whole system of racial stratification and segregation was utter nonsense. And this is what he's arguing within the confines. But you kind of get this sense where the U.S. are going, well, South Africa is a member of the British Commonwealth, and the British are backing them. And, you know, and then every time we meet with the South Africans, they go, well, you know, we're fighting this fight for you, too. Because if the UN comes after us for racial segregation, you can imagine the field day they're going to have on you with Jim Crow. So, you know, we're carrying this shield for you too. You need to get behind us. And so you had all of those forces converging in there. So the debate raged on not only in this period, but the debate raged on throughout. Where you had voices in the State Department going, "Oh, this is wrong. South Africa is so wrong, and we do not need to be on this train." And so and one of the things, part of the savvy of the NAACP was figuring out who had that voice and getting their information in that bureaucracy to that voice to continue to shape policy.
And between 1945 and 1947, James F. Burns was Secretary of State from South Carolina. So that's part of it.
It sure is.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, it's like the visions. The fight between Du Bois and Walter White was legendary. I'm talking clash of the titans. And part of that clash was that both men had egos about the size of this room. So you can imagine when both tried to come into the door at the same time. They both believed that they were the leaders. Now, unfortunately, what you have happening here, I mean, as I look at this, when the NAACP was just, as I say, smoking, was when you had Walter White, who had political savvy par excellence. I mean, this man had a political level of brilliance. You know, there's some folks who are just born politicians. That was Walter White. Du Bois had vision. I mean, he could see the larger picture. And then Roy Wilkins had operational skills like none other. So he could take that vision, he could take that politics, and then figure out how to make sure that the NAACP had the resources in order to pull off that plan. When that organization was just, is when you had all three working, but they never worked well together. I mean, that's the thing that gets like really crazy. They never worked well together, but they somehow, for a minute, were able to kind of put it aside, saying, okay, this is for the greater good. But next time, I take the lead. Next time, this is about my plan. Next time, this is about me. And so that was part of it. The big blow up began in the mid-1930s, where Du Bois, who's looking at the depths of the Great Depression. I mean, in some communities, African Americans had an 80% unemployment rate. And so part of what I do when I'm teaching this is I start having my students stand up, because they need to visualize what 80% unemployment rate looks like. So I'm like, okay, you're out of work, you're out of work, you're out of work, you're out of work, you're out of work. And as they begin to stand up in this auditorium, and then when only 2 people are sitting down, it begins to kind of resonate. And so Du Bois is looking at this going, this whole American thing is not working. We need to make sure we have strong black institutions. We need to make sure we have strong black universities, strong black businesses. And that's the editorial that he writes in The Crisis. Walter White looks at this and says, you seem to be advocating segregation. That is everything that we are against. And that begins the clash of the titans. They had been nipping at each other over the years when Walter White got there, but now it was just out in the open. Du Bois leaves, he goes and teaches at Atlanta University. 1944, Walter White invites him back in to the NAACP because he realizes that Du Bois has a brilliance about anti-colonialism and human rights that no one else has. And he knows he needs that kind of vision and intellectual firepower at the NAACP to move that organization forward. When Walter White invites Du Bois in, and I love Du Bois, but oh Lord, the man's got issues. When he invites Du Bois in, Du Bois doesn't answer Walter White. Du Bois goes around Walter White and goes to the board of directors and talks to them. And so Walter's like, I haven't heard from you. And Du Bois is like, I'm sorry, I only speak to the chairman. I don't speak to you. So this is how they began, right? This is how they began. It's almost sounding like a faculty meeting, isn't it? And Walter happened to be on a world tour when Du Bois first got to the office. And Du Bois has all of his books and everything. And so they say, okay, well, Du Bois, you can take Walter's office for the time being until he gets back. But everybody would understand this is temporary. Except Du Bois. So Du Bois moves all of his books in there, and his desk in there. And then when Walter comes back, Walter's like, that would be my office. And Du Bois is like, well, there's one down the hall somewhere, a little closet somewhere. And thus it begins. And so they're arguing over strategy. They're arguing over anti-colonialism. They're arguing over secretarial support. They're arguing over everything. By the time you get to 48, Du Bois is making his shift to the left. He's been talking a lot with James and Esther Jackson, who are black communists. He's falling in love with Shirley Graham, who's also a member, who's also very leftist, and he's beginning to support Henry Wallace in the 1948 presidential campaign, who's a progressive. The NAACP, although it has a nonpartisan thing, is openly supporting Harry Truman. And so with Du Bois standing up, being identified as a member of the NAACP, going, vote for Henry, he'll set you free, the clash begins again, full-blown, and it blows up over Eleanor Roosevelt and human rights. So between Eleanor, Harry Truman, human rights, and Henry Wallace, where Du Bois writes a scathing letter to Walter White, refusing to provide him any advice on the upcoming UN meeting dealing with the Declaration of Human Rights. And it gets put in the New York Times before it even gets to Walter White's desk. Du Bois is fired in 1948. Yeah.
Carol, we want to thank you for